Over the last several days, court filings connected to Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni have drawn renewed attention, not because the claims in the case changed, but because the court record itself did. According to the docket, deposition testimony that had previously been treated as sealed during discovery later appeared in filings that became publicly accessible. That shift from confidential handling to public visibility is what has prompted questions about how the process unfolded and how deposition material moves through the court system. In federal litigation, deposition testimony, protective orders, and discovery materials follow specific procedural paths. Those paths determine how depositions are designated, when testimony remains restricted, and under what circumstances it can be referenced in court filings that enter the public record. When that sequence changes, it often reshapes how a case is discussed, even in the absence of any ruling. In this case, filings involving Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and related parties have become a focal point because deposition testimony designated under a protective order was later included in submissions that appeared on the docket. The record reflects a transition point, not a conclusion, but a procedural development that affects visibility. This video does not assess intent or outcome. Instead, it walks through the sequence itself, how deposition testimony is handled during discovery, how filings are submitted to the court, and how deposition material can move from restricted status into the public record under existing rules. By tracing that process step by step, using what appears on the docket and how federal courts manage deposition filings, this breakdown focuses on structure rather than speculation, and on what the court record shows, rather than what anyone claims it means. Renewed attention in this case did not begin with a ruling, a motion outcome, or a change in the claims themselves. It began with how deposition testimony appeared in court filings and where those filings surfaced on the docket. According to the court record, deposition testimony exchanged during discovery had been designated under a protective order, placing it within the confidential framework that typically governs discovery materials. That designation controlled how the testimony could be shared and referenced while it remained outside the filing system. What changed was not the existence of the testimony, but the procedural context in which it later appeared. The trigger came when portions of that deposition testimony were referenced in filings submitted in federal court. Once those filings were accepted and entered on the docket, the testimony became visible as part of the public record. That transition from confidential discovery material to publicly accessible filing reframed how the case was discussed and why attention shifted. Renewed attention in this case did not begin with a ruling, a motion outcome, or a change in the claims themselves. It began with how deposition testimony appeared in court filings and where those filings surfaced on the docket. According to the court record, deposition testimony exchanged during discovery had been designated under a protective order, placing it within the confidential framework that typically governs discovery materials. That designation controlled how the testimony could be shared and referenced while it remained outside the filing system. What changed was not the existence of the testimony, but the procedural context in which it later appeared. The trigger came when portions of that deposition testimony were referenced in filings submitted in federal court. Once those filings were accepted and entered on the docket, the testimony became visible as part of the public record. That transition from confidential discovery material to publicly accessible filing reframed how the case was discussed and why attention shifted. This sequence matters because discovery and filings operate under different procedural rules. During discovery, parties exchange materials privately, guided by protective orders that limit disclosure. Filings, by contrast, are submissions to the court itself. Once accepted, they are presumed public unless sealed or redacted. When deposition testimony moves from one system into the other, its status can change without any ruling on the substance of the case. In this instance, filings involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni became a focal point because deposition testimony that had been treated as sealed during discovery later appeared in filings that were not immediately restricted from public view. The issue was not what the testimony said. It was how it entered the filing system and how that process interacted with the existing protective order. The court record reflects this procedural shift clearly. It shows when the filings were submitted, how they were docketed, and whether they were publicly accessible at the time they appeared. It does not, on its own, Resolve whether the handling of the deposition testimony aligned perfectly with the protective order. That determination typically requires further procedural steps. This is where renewed attention centered. Observers were not responding to new evidence or new allegations. They were responding to a visible change in the status of existing material. The appearance of deposition testimony on the docket signaled that a procedural boundary had been crossed from discovery into formal court filings. In federal litigation, these moments often draw scrutiny because they highlight how confidentiality and transparency intersect. Protective orders govern discovery, but filing rules govern the court record. When testimony moves between those frameworks, questions arise about how the transition was managed. Understanding this trigger requires focusing on sequence rather than intent. The record shows how deposition testimony moved through the system, how it appeared in filings, and why that visibility prompted renewed discussion. That procedural movement, not a substantive ruling, is what set this phase of the case in motion. To understand why the appearance of deposition testimony in filings drew attention, it is necessary to separate two procedural systems that operate simultaneously in federal litigation: discovery and court filings. Discovery is the phase where parties exchange information outside the public docket. This includes documents, written responses, and sworn testimony. Depositions are a central part of this phase. They involve witnesses answering questions under oath, with the testimony recorded and transcribed. These transcripts are then shared between the parties as discovery materials. Because discovery often involves sensitive information, courts routinely issue protective orders. A protective order establishes how discovery materials, including deposition testimony, may be used, shared, and disclosed. When testimony is designated under a protective order, it is typically treated as confidential during discovery. That designation does not remove the testimony from the case. It simply limits how it can be handled at that stage. Court filings operate under a different framework. Filings are submissions made directly to the court, such as motions, briefs, and exhibits. Once a filing is accepted and entered on the docket, it becomes part of the court record. In federal court, the default presumption is public access to the court record unless a filing is sealed or redacted. This creates a procedural transition point. Discovery materials can remain confidential indefinitely if they stay within discovery. But once those same materials are referenced or attached to filings, they move into the filing system. At that moment, the rules governing public access apply unless specific steps are taken to restrict visibility. Protective orders often anticipate this scenario. Many include provisions explaining how confidential discovery materials should be handled if they are later used in court filings. These provisions typically require parties to seek sealing or redaction when submitting such material to the court. The responsibility rests with the filing party to invoke those protections at the time of filing. The court record reflects whether those steps were taken. It shows which filings were submitted, how they were classified, and whether they were accessible to the public. What it does not do is resolve disputes about whether a filing should have been handled differently. That requires further procedural action. This distinction is important. A filing can appear on the docket without any judicial determination that its contents were properly or improperly disclosed. The presence of deposition testimony in the court record signals that it was filed. It does not signal that the court has ruled on how it should ultimately be treated. Understanding this baseline helps explain why procedural attention often centers on filings rather than discovery itself. The moment discovery materials cross into the filing system is where visibility changes. That change can prompt scrutiny even when no substantive ruling has occurred. In short, discovery governs how testimony is gathered and exchanged. Filings govern how materials enter the court record. When deposition testimony moves from one system to the other, it enters a new procedural context, and that context determines what the public can see. The procedural divergence in this case did not emerge because of disagreement over what occurred during discovery. It emerged once deposition testimony crossed into the filing system and different interpretations of that transition began to surface. At the discovery stage, the process was largely straightforward. Testimony was taken, transcripts were exchanged, and confidentiality designations were applied under a protective order. That framework governed how the material could be used and shared between the parties. The dispute did not center on whether the testimony existed or whether it was properly obtained. The divergence appeared once the testimony was referenced in court filings and entered on the docket. At that point, two procedural frameworks intersected. One framework emphasized the origin of the material, discovery, and the continuing effect of the protective order. The other emphasized the nature of filings and the presumption of public access to the court record once documents are submitted. This intersection often produces tension in federal litigation. Protective orders are designed to regulate discovery. Filing rules are designed to govern what enters the court record. When discovery materials are incorporated into filings, the question becomes which framework controls at that moment and under what conditions. The court record reflects this tension without resolving it. It shows when filings were submitted, how they were processed, and whether they appeared publicly. What it does not show is a determination about whether the testimony should have remained confidential at that stage. That determination typically requires additional procedural steps. This is where interpretations began to diverge. Some focused on the language of the protective order and the expectation that deposition testimony designated as confidential would remain restricted. Others focused on the mechanics of filing, noting that materials included in filings are subject to public access rules unless sealed or redacted. Importantly, this divergence is procedural, not substantive. It does not turn on the content of the testimony. It turns on the sequence of events and the rules governing each step. The question is not what was said during the deposition, but how that testimony was handled once it entered the filing system. In federal court, these questions are often resolved through motions seeking clarification, sealing, or modification of the record. Until such motions are filed and addressed, the docket reflects the filings as they stand. The presence of testimony in the court record signals that a procedural step occurred, not that a dispute has been adjudicated. This distinction matters because it explains why attention can intensify even in the absence of a ruling. The visibility of filings can prompt discussion before the court has addressed how the material should be treated. That gap between filing and resolution is where procedural disagreements tend to surface. In this case, the divergence centered on how deposition testimony moved from discovery into filings and how that movement interacted with the protective order. The record shows the sequence. It does not yet show the resolution. When disputes arise over how deposition testimony appears in court filings, the court's response is procedural and document-driven rather than rhetorical. The court does not respond to commentary or interpretation. It responds to motions, filings, and the record before it. The first thing the court looks at is the docket itself. The docket reflects what was filed, when it was filed, and how it was classified at the time of entry. If deposition testimony appears in a filing that was not sealed or redacted, the court record will show it as publicly accessible unless and until the court takes further action. In federal court, this sequence is common. Filings are accepted first. Requests to seal or modify access often follow. The filing system is designed to preserve the order of events, not to anticipate disputes. As a result, the court record may show materials as public even while questions about confidentiality remain unresolved. When a party believes that deposition testimony subject to a protective order should not be publicly accessible, the procedural mechanism is to file a motion. That motion asks the court to seal the filing, redact specific portions, or otherwise modify how the material appears in the court record. The court evaluates such requests under established standards, balancing public access against confidentiality interests. Until the court rules on those requests, the docket reflects the filings as they stand. The court does not retroactively erase entries. It manages access going forward. This is why visibility can exist without resolution. The presence of testimony in the court record signals that a procedural step occurred, not that the court has endorsed or rejected how that step was handled. Protective orders play a role at this stage, but they do not automatically control the filing system. While protective orders govern discovery materials, filings are governed by court rules and judicial discretion. When discovery materials are incorporated into filings, the court determines how those materials should be treated within the filing framework. This incremental approach is intentional. Courts prioritize clarity and record integrity. They address disputes through orders that become part of the record themselves. Each step, filing, motion, order, appears on the docket in sequence. The court record also reflects timing. Motions may be filed days or weeks after the filing that prompted concern. Orders may follow later still. During that period, the record remains visible in its existing form. That visibility does not imply an action. It reflects the structured pace of procedural review. This is why procedural disputes often appear static from the outside. The court's response is not immediate or expressive. It is methodical. It unfolds through filings and orders that modify the record step by step. Understanding this response helps explain why attention often focuses on the docket rather than on rulings. The docket shows how the process is unfolding in real time. The court's role is to manage that process, not to react to how it is discussed. Once deposition testimony appears in court filings and becomes visible on the docket, it is often interpreted as a decisive moment. Procedurally, however, visibility does not equal resolution. In federal litigation, the court record serves as a snapshot of what has been filed, not a declaration of how disputes will be resolved. A document's presence in the public record indicates that a filing was accepted and entered on the docket. It does not indicate that the court has ruled on whether the material should remain public, be sealed, or be modified. This distinction is critical when deposition testimony subject to a protective order becomes visible through filings. Protective orders regulate how discovery materials are handled during discovery. They do not automatically dictate how those materials appear once they are incorporated into court filings. When testimony moves into the filing system, it enters a separate procedural framework governed by filing rules and judicial review. The docket reflects this separation clearly. It records filings in the order they are submitted. If a filing includes deposition testimony and is not accompanied by a sealing request, it may appear publicly even while questions about confidentiality remain open. That public appearance can prompt scrutiny, but it does not resolve whether the filing complied with the protective order or whether restrictions should apply going forward. This is where momentum and procedure often diverge. Public discussion accelerates as soon as filings become visible. Observers treat access as outcome. The court, however, treats access as a temporary condition subject to review. The procedural response unfolds through motions, responses, and orders, not through immediate changes to the record. In cases involving well-known parties, including Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and Reynolds, this gap between visibility and resolution can feel especially pronounced. High-profile names draw attention quickly, but the court's process moves at its own pace. The presence of filings on the docket does not compress that timeline. The court record captures this reality by showing sequence rather than judgment. It shows when deposition testimony was filed, whether it was accessible, and whether subsequent motions were submitted. It does not show intent. It does not show conclusions. It shows process. This is why visibility should be read cautiously. A filing can be public today and sealed tomorrow. Portions of testimony can be redacted later. The record is dynamic. Until the court issues an order addressing how specific materials should be treated, the status reflected on the docket remains provisional. Understanding this helps frame what the court record is actually communicating. It is not announcing resolution. It is documenting movement. Each entry reflects a step, not an endpoint. In this context, visibility functions as context rather than confirmation. It signals that the process has reached a stage where filings are being examined and potentially challenged. It does not signal that the court has endorsed any particular interpretation of how deposition testimony should have been handled. For that reason, the appearance of deposition testimony in court filings should be understood as part of an ongoing procedural sequence. The record shows where the case is, not where it will end. At this stage, the court record reflects a case in motion rather than a case resolved. The procedural sequence that brought deposition testimony into court filings has unfolded, but the process governing how that material will ultimately be treated remains ongoing. The docket shows what has occurred so far. Filings were submitted, deposition testimony appeared within those filings, and the material became visible as part of the public court record. What the docket does not show, at least yet, is a final determination about whether that testimony should remain publicly accessible, be sealed, or be modified through redaction. In federal court, this posture is not unusual. Filings often precede motions addressing confidentiality. Courts address such questions methodically through written submissions and formal orders. Until that happens, the record reflects the status of filings as entered, not the outcome of disputes that may follow. This is where interpretation must remain disciplined. The appearance of deposition testimony in the court record indicates that a procedural step occurred. It does not indicate that the court has ruled on compliance with a protective order, nor does it signal how the court will balance public access against confidentiality interests if asked to do so. For now, the record shows that discovery materials moved into the filing system and that those filings were processed in the ordinary course. Whether additional procedural steps will follow, such as motions to seal or clarify the handling of testimony, depends on how the parties proceed and how the court responds. Cases involving recognizable names, including Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and Ryan Reynolds, tend to attract attention at this stage because the record becomes more visible. That visibility can create the impression of resolution. Procedurally, however, it represents a midpoint rather than an endpoint. The court record remains the most reliable guide to what has actual. It does not speculate. It does not project outcomes. It reflects the process as it unfolds. As of now, the process has reached a phase where filings have been examined and their visibility has prompted scrutiny. What comes next will be determined by formal procedural actions, not by the presence of the filings themselves. Until the court issues further orders, the status reflected on the docket remains provisional. This is the distinction that matters most at this stage. The record shows movement, not conclusion. It shows how deposition testimony entered filings and how those filings appeared on the docket. It does not yet show how the court will ultimately treat that material. Understanding where the case currently stands requires resisting the urge to read visibility as outcome. The process continues through motions, responses, and judicial review. The court record will reflect those steps when they occur. For now, the case sits at a procedural crossroads. The filings are visible. The questions raised by that visibility remain open. And the next developments, when they come, will appear where they always do, in the court record itself. What ultimately matters in this phase of the case is not how visible certain filings have become, but how the court manages that visibility moving forward. The court record does not operate on inference or reaction. It operates on sequence. It shows when deposition testimony enters court filings, how those filings appear on the docket, and whether any procedural steps are taken to modify access. Until the court issues an order addressing those steps, the record reflects process rather than outcome. In cases like this, involving Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and Ryan Reynolds, public attention often accelerates faster than the legal system itself. But the court's role is not to match that pace. It is to apply rules governing discovery, filings, and public access in a structured way, one motion and one order at a time. That distinction is essential. Visibility does not resolve disputes. It marks a point in the process where questions can be raised and addressed through formal procedure. The appearance of deposition testimony in the court record signals that a procedural transition occurred, not that the court has endorsed any interpretation of how that transition should be viewed. As the case continues, any changes to how testimony is handled will appear where they always do, in filings, motions, and orders reflected on the docket. Those entries will clarify how the court balances protective orders against public access and how the record is managed going forward. Until then, the most accurate way to read the situation is through the record itself. Not commentary, not assumptions, just the sequence the court has documented. That sequence shows a system doing what it is designed to do, managing filings, addressing disputes procedurally, and allowing the process to unfold according to the rules that govern federal court cases.